think what's becoming glaringly apparent is that we're living in a broken city. A broken city with broken systems that really is not benefiting anybody. I don't think anybody in this city is being benefited by the way the system currently works. And that's a travesty. And it's, you know, a shame we got to assemble people who already know the answer to this to come to this conclusion, and we aren't even at the end of the program yet. But there's a real problem here that we have to address. And it is part of why we brought you in this room. We put the call out there for you to come into the room, because we got to make some serious changes in this city. So what I want to do is turn back to some of our research friends up here, because there is a study that came out recently, a tale of 3 cities, cost of segregation report. There's information that's coming out that really lays out how this system is breeding inequity. You would hope, right, that where you live, where you raise your families, where you invest, will have an eye towards equity. But unfortunately, the powers that be are creating systems that entrench and deepen inequity in our city. So Alden is here with the Metropolitan Planning Council. You all have the cost of segregation report in the Cliff Notes kind of way. Can you really give us a snapshot of what you found in producing that report as it relates to housing? And I really want to bring Dr. Inya up after that to just talk about some of the reactions you had to the study and really just unpack your vision for how we need to think about this conversation going forward. So,
Okay, so last year the Metropolitan Planning Council released something called the Cost of Segregation Report. And essentially the report was an attempt to quantify the financial or economic impact of racial and economic segregation in the Chicago region. The report was based off of research done by the Urban Institute and by the Metropolitan Planning Council. And in a nutshell, what the Urban Institute did was they looked at the 100 largest metros in the nation, Chicago among them, and looked at a host of quality of life indicators, and they also looked at 3 measurements of segregation: economic segregation, segregation between whites and Latinos, and segregation between African Americans and whites. And what they found was that there were statistically significant links between racial segregation, primarily black-white segregation, and a number of indicators. The indicators that we focused on where the strongest links were on income, were on homicides, and were on educational attainment. And what the Urban Institute's research shows is that as you increase the level of black-white segregation, when you look across those 100 metros, you see lower levels of African-American income. As you increase the levels of black-white segregation across those 100 metros, you see lower levels of bachelor's degree attainment by both African-Americans and whites. And when you increase those levels of black-white segregation across those 100 metros, you also see higher levels of homicides. And based on those findings, the Urban Institute calculated what the cost to the Chicago region was because of its heightened levels of segregation. And what those costs were, essentially, was a measurement of where the Chicago region could be if we were at the median level, primarily of black-white segregation, but also median level of economic segregation, which also had a statistically significant link to black income. So where we would be is we would be $4.4 billion richer each year. African Americans in the Chicago region, that's the 7-county Chicago region, would earn in aggregate $4.4 billion more a year if we were at the median level of black-white segregation. The Chicago region would see 30% fewer homicides if we were at the median level of black-white segregation. And there would be, over the course of a decade, 83,000 more people gaining or present in the Chicago region with bachelor's degrees. And again, those are numbers that are all derived from taking a look at where Chicago is and where Chicago could be if it were at the median level. And just for context, the Chicago region in a combined metric is 5th overall in the nation out of the 100 largest metros in terms of its racial and economic segregation. If you break it down, in 2010, which is where these figures have come from, we were 9th in Latino white segregation, 10th in black white segregation, and 20th in economic segregation. And then when they combined all three, we were 5th overall. Just a throwback to our earlier conversation about the Great Migration and all of the segregation that we saw happening in those cities as the migration was happening. The 10 regions that had the highest levels of combined racial and economic segregation were all Great Migration destination cities. So I mentioned them earlier: Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, Los Angeles, all among the top 10. And so this cost of segregation and that history that we talked about is all linked. It's all linked. And while we can't explain in great detail from this research the why, I think when we really dig into what was happening on the ground in Chicago and many of those other places, I think you start to understand. You may not be able to pull it together in a clear narrative or have data or research that clearly says this is connected to this. But I think this report and our understanding of how these cities evolved over that time and what we knew what was happening on the ground, I think we have great fodder to understand that the separation, the very deliberate separation of people, the very deliberate separation of resources, the very deliberate separation of people by policy has this incredible impact that we all suffer from. So that $4.4 billion of black income translates to $8 billion of additional gross domestic product for the region. One group of people has more money, they're spending more money, and the economy as overall benefits from that. You have more people with bachelor's degrees, that's black people and white people, mind you. You have a higher earning workforce. And of course, if we have fewer homicides, we have greater property values, and we spend less in terms of our policing and our corrections. So we're all paying a cost for the impact of our racial and economic segregation. And even if you're in a lily white community and you are gated and you feel safe from your surroundings, you're paying a cost. So that was the nuts and bolts of our report. You can find it online. Is there more? Great. Thank you.
You're paying the cost. I think that the idea of cost, you can just extrapolate out further and further and further. There's a lot that we're paying for. Right? Dr. Enya, can you come up and kind of share your thoughts on not just the report itself, but this notion of segregation as being sort of the curse or the scourge of our city, and just, again, kind of where you see us moving forward?
So I read the Cost of Segregation report right when it came out with great interest. And I definitely understood the argument for laying out how this costs the entire city, the entire region, because for a lot of people who don't live in the circumstances that many of us find ourselves in terms of living in communities that have been disinvested, marginalized, and overlooked, sometimes they need something that shows how they're paying for this current system as a push in the hopes that they will adopt some measures to change or even a catalyst to change. But a couple of things struck me when I read the report. So the first thing I want to say is when I talk about the power structure, I'm referring to all of the actors, the gatekeepers, the elected officials who make the decisions that affect our lives, who are supposed to be responsive to us, but in many instances are not. That's what I mean when I talk about the power structure. And I started to wonder about using this word segregation. I come from an immigrant family, and our headquarters, so to speak, was on the north side of Chicago, where all the Africans lived. I loved being in Uptown, Rogers Park, Edgewater, the restaurants. I loved seeing our people, hearing our languages. If I had a choice, that's where I would move, because I wanted to be in that space. Many families make those sorts of decisions. You move to an area where you have a network of people, you know people. That is understanding the fact that there are public policies that have segmented people into particular areas, as Alden and Janet have pointed out. So there's some intentionality about that. But that doesn't necessarily erase the fact that some of us actually like where we live. I live on the west side of Chicago, in Garfield Park. And I like where I live, and I like the people that I live with. So what became clear to me as we talk about some of the solutions and where we can go is the fact that we don't talk enough about value, and we don't talk enough about equity. So segregation as a tool allows the power structure to assign value, meaning that what has become apparently clear in this city and in this region is that different groups have different values. And based upon their values, they are afforded access to the resources and amenities and things that we should all be entitled to by virtue of being here. So it wasn't necessarily the fact that the community is predominantly Black or Latino or whatever. It was the fact that that group is not valued by the power structure, and therefore the investments and resources are not allocated to that group. And yet we never talk about that. We talk about the notion of segregation in a way that almost makes it seem as though it's a negative to have a homogenous group. And so my background, my PhD is in education policy, and I did a lot of work around Brown v. Board. And what struck me is the fact that the issue in the schools that were Black was not the fact that they were Black kids. It was the fact that that school was starved of the resources that predominantly white schools got, whether it was resources for books, for whatever technology existed at the time, for materials, for well-paid teachers and staff. Those were the things that did not exist because those Black kids were not valued by the power structure. But our public policy for the last maybe 60 years or so has created a condition where the onus now falls on the marginalized, undervalued group to have to uproot themselves and move to a particular area where a valued population gets all the things that we all should be entitled to. So even as we look at housing, for example, if I wanted to have access to schools, parks, a grocery store, all the things that we all value and like in our neighborhoods, I would have to uproot myself and move to an area where the population is perhaps more diverse, but really has more of the valued population in it, and therefore they get the resources. And so to me what that means is it means that we don't hold the decision makers in the power structure, all of the individuals responsible, accountable. And instead we put the onus on the marginalized to have to move around to where they can hope to get closer to the more valued population. What that looks like is busing. So instead of actually investing in the schools in those challenged neighborhoods, those kids have to be bused to another neighborhood. Perhaps in the short term, it works, it's a quick fix, but that's not a long-term solution. And decades after Brown, we're finding that school districts are actually resegregating. In housing, it's the same thing. Perhaps we were moved out of the suburbs. They said, oh, here's some vouchers, you can go to name your suburb, where there was less infrastructure, less supportive services, access to transportation was substandard in many instances. And yet many families took that opportunity because in their minds, they had to go where the population was valued, where they had good schools, they had parks, they had access to all of the resources that we all want. And so I actually challenge those decades of public policy in a way that causes us to rethink how we've been doing this all along, and who we've been holding accountable, and how, and have we been holding those responsible accountable for this current paradigm. I think that we should acknowledge that there has not been a commitment to equity. My premise is that we all want the same things at the end of the day, for the most part. I don't know a person who says, well, I want to live in a neighborhood where I have to be afraid of gunshots when I walk out the door. I don't know a family in my neighborhood that says, well, I want to have to travel 3 or 4 miles to go to the grocery store. I don't know a person or a family that says, I want to live somewhere where my schools are subpar, but that's okay. Nobody says those things. So the reality is that the things that a family in Lakeview wants are the same things that a family in Roseland wants. The things that I want in Garfield Park are the same things that folks want in Humboldt Park, or Headwish, or Rogers Park. And yet our power structure treats us as though we want different things. So what becomes acceptable for my neighborhood, where economic development is a police training institute, is completely unacceptable in another community, where economic development looks like hundreds of millions of dollars of actual investment. Because we haven't addressed the issue of value and who's valued and who's not, and we have not addressed the issue of equity, we have circumstances like what happens on the Northwest Side, where, oh no, this unvalued population is coming in to this affordable housing development. What are we going to do? It's created some of the most vitriolic circumstances that I have seen in a long time. But who's responsible for that? So as we talk about solutions and strategies, as a matter of policy, we have to start by first holding the power structure accountable. When it comes to affordable housing, do we give developers an out so they can just pay a fine, right? Or do we mandate affordable housing? Like, these are the sort of technical and tangible things that we should be moving toward that speak more to the issue of the value proposition and what we're entitled to, and this notion of equity that we are all entitled to the same things, whether we have disabilities or not, regardless of our income or our economic standing, that by virtue of being here, being residents, we're entitled, and our public policy should reflect that. But until we start to push that narrative, we'll see that the policymakers are they're far away from this conversation, because we're still thinking about how to move people around, move marginalized groups around, so that we don't actually have to deal with the fact that we value groups differently.
So I've got some questions from the audience. The first one is, can you please talk about housing segregation as an import on schools, specifically school quality? The answer to that is come back to the second panel on March 6th, where we're going to be talking about that intersection. So we've got another question for the present. A study by Housing Plus argues that there is enough underutilized space in existing buildings to create 130,000 new units of housing, most of which at the garden level, which would be accessible to people with limited mobility and those who use wheelchairs. Should we pursue this policy of change and incentivize landlords to convert underutilized space to new accessible units? And I believe Adam Ballard is going to come up and answer that.
I talk real loud. Oh, the crowd got bigger. Can y'all hear me in the back? Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Ballard. I do organizing and also housing policy at Access Living. So Angela is one of our leaders, and I'm extremely proud of her. But this is a question that we didn't prep for, so that's why I'm going to take it. Housing Plus is a concept that we are very familiar with. It is a good idea. I just want to say a couple things about it. It's hard to know for sure, how much housing it will create. It will create a lot. But that also ties into what I think we're going to continue to talk about with the rest of the panel, is that creating a whole bunch of new housing for people with disabilities creates a whole bunch of good problems, because we can't afford to live anywhere. So if you create a whole bunch of unsubsidized units, they still aren't going to be filled. So we still need more rental subsidy, more vouchers, more public housing, more resources. It's still a question of resources, like Amara just said. So yes, Housing Plus, and there's other ideas out there. There's a lot of great ideas out there. I could tell you about more, but Housing Plus is absolutely a great idea, but it won't ever be fully implemented just by incentivizing landlords. We have to make those units that are created affordable as well. So yes, thank you.
Okay. where are there role models for the type of multi-ethnic, mixed income, accessible, inclusive communities we desire, whether locally, nationally, or globally, and what can we learn from them? So that's going to be for anybody that wants to take on that question. Are there any utopias out there?
Well, maybe we can do.
Yeah, hopefully, so we can have some of our others. Okay, so this makes me think about research I did when I was at the Chicago Reporter at the time when the plan for transformation was kind of in its early years. And so the third mix that the CHA was saying they wanted to achieve through these new developments. So, so I did research looking at where there existed in Cook County census tracts that had a third mix that CHA was envisioning for the mixed income communities. And I found that 6% of Cook County's population, over 5 million people, lived in census tracts that had representative income mixes that CHA was trying to achieve. Carrie Latterson wrote a story based on the research. And so our takeaway was that this just isn't typically how we live. And so we posited that as a notion that the CHA was essentially trying to achieve something that doesn't naturally occur. And perhaps, since it doesn't naturally occur, it won't occur very easily, even with their $1.6 billion in plan. In terms of thinking about where we have racially kind of mixed areas, there are a number of places in the Chicago region where that kind of, where those racial mixes exist. Tracts that do not have a racial majority and are generally a mixture of 2 or 3 or more different racial groups. The problem is about 3/4 of those census tracts don't maintain that mix for longer than a decade. And so there are a few exceptions, places in Uptown, and when I say places, I mean maybe 1 or 2 census tracts. Rogers Park has 1 tract. I take that. Uptown has maybe 3 or 4, I believe. Edgewater has a couple. Evanston has 1, or Park, I think, has 1 or 2. So there are a few places in the region where we seem to have developed that mix and we've maintained them for 2 or 3 decades or more. The problem is that we can literally count them on maybe 3 or 4 hands. So it exists, it doesn't exist for very long, and there aren't very many of them.
Professor Ben?
Mixed income housing and affordable housing are 2 terms that basically poison the whole discussion, in my opinion. They are completely artificial, socially engineered ways of bringing populations together that don't want to be together or cannot live together because they just don't belong together. I'm sorry.
All right, John.
I think you just dropped the mic. All right. I won't use those terms anymore. All right, so we're going to move into the future part of our panel, all right? So we're going to have a little bit of a free-for-all. We're going to let each panelist speak on it as they best see fit. I'm going to weight this question a little bit for you, Dr. Smith, and ask that you talk a little bit about the plan for transformation in your response, since it is such a loaded, heaping pile of policy. If we can ask each of you to respond to 2 questions. Number 1, what does housing equity look like to you? What are the root factors operating against that vision that you have? And then number 2, see if we can write it down. And then number 2, beyond combating symptom after symptom of the problem, how do we go about addressing the real structural factors that impede our ability to achieve housing equity in this system? Yes, we've got a doozy for you.
For food and we're going to stay for the night?
order a couple of pizzas. Well, yeah, why don't you start it off? Come on. Dr. Smith. And then we'll circle back around. He just talked.
Okay. So the housing equity question, and then how to deal with the structure and the symptoms. Boy, that was my housing lecture on Monday. You asked me about CHA, and I just want to point out that I think one of the things I remember when I've been early on a critical person of the mixed income concept, and probably for a lot of the same reasons my colleague John is. I think I go back to Amara's statement about where you live and your choice to live with your people is different than being forced to live in a place because there are restrictions on you. Okay, so I think that's really important. And I think when we look at the plan for transformation and a lot of the policy arguments behind this, remember the plan for transformation was just probably the biggest example. Actually, Baltimore topped us even in terms of demolition. But in terms of the biggest example of an experiment of transforming public housing quickly from segregated low-income housing to mixed-income housing, Chicago, demonstrates all the reasons why that wasn't going to work in the first place, because we didn't deal with the real structural problems. We didn't acknowledge we had all these things that the first topics that we talked about in the past existed. So we just kind of ignored history, ignored the reasons we had segregation, and said, okay, let's just take 6,000 to 8,000 people, and in a year we're going to give them vouchers and say, you're going to go out and you're going to move into a white community and get all the benefits of being white. But you're black, but go for it. Let's see how it goes. Right, so there's that. I mean, there was just a pure acknowledgement. Let's just acknowledge that that was the starting place. Right, so we have this problem. And we have resources and means to help people move and make mobility moves as they're talked about, but there was an ignorance by choice of the starting fact, the starting conditions, and the history that produced them. So I think that's one thing I really want to emphasize, and why I would argue that the plan for transformation will always be a failure in that regard. If it was really about mixing people, it would do so much more. Public housing represented at the time less than 3% of our housing stock in Chicago. So I said to someone once, wouldn't it be cool if we looked at the other 97% of our housing stock and did the same, I swore at that time, thing? Right? So why don't we just say, hey, let's mix up, I don't know, Lincoln Park. Right? Or let's go into Lincoln Park and say, by the way, we're going to tear down 38,000 units here. Sorry. And you're going to have to move out. You know what? That represents more than half of the land in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Can you imagine the reaction that would be? I had an artist friend who actually did a drawing of that, what it would look like, and mapped out how much would be lost. We wouldn't do that. So I mean, that's the way the public housing redevelopment is going in the city of Chicago. Okay, I'm getting into a lot of different thoughts in this, but my main point here, I would say, is that when we're talking about housing equity, we have to recognize that we're really dealing with creating a level playing field, and that we're talking about actually leveling a playing field that has been unlevel for many reasons cited earlier, and continues to be unlevel because we don't acknowledge that those things exist. And if we're going to really talk about choice, which is the renaming of the voucher, remember back in 1990, the Clinton administration was clever. It's all about branding. So it became the housing choice voucher. You have choice. Go at it. We didn't have real choices available to people, so we have to think about that. And the real choice can include, I want to stay in a neighborhood that gets improved. If you go back to that time period, there were a couple prongs of the housing, of the policy that the federal government and the Clinton administration was trying to promote. One was mobility, the things that I really applaud, and I remember when you wrote your op-ed piece in Crane, you were raising all the questions I had about mobility is not the solution. It is one, maybe opportunity for people to move, yes. But the idea that, yes, one is mobility, helping people move into better communities. The other, though, the other prong of this three-prong program, one was public housing redevelopment, was to invest in communities that have not been invested in. What happened to that prong? Oops, my pockets are empty. We can't afford to do that. There was a lot of lack of just not acknowledging that that third prong was completely ignored in a three-prong system. And so there's that part of it, which is continued disinvestment by choice in our country. So that, to me, if we're going to start talking about structure, changing structure and dealing with symptoms, let's acknowledge there are structural problems we have to deal with. And I would say a very fundamental one, and this is a complicated one, is getting back to the contract buyers. There is a whole discussion going on right now about reparations. Yes. And if we talk about real reparations, I'm not just talking just the individuals who are impacted, I'm talking whole communities. And if we, and I'm working with a group of people who are trying to actually calculate what that would cost. And there's going to be a big bill. Thank you.
So just three quick points if we're talking about what housing equity looks like and sort of what the root causes are. I think it's difficult to talk about housing without addressing the economic imperative, meaning that affordability is contingent upon an individual or family's ability to sustain themselves. And so as we're talking about housing, oftentimes we look at some of the policies that we could put in place, so for example, around rent control or around how to disperse affordable housing around the city. But if we don't have a conversation about wage stagnation and the fact that everyone is underpaid and the fact that we are not able to afford to live in any communities, then we'll continue to have, it'll be an incomplete conversation with solutions that are only half-baked and don't get to the root cause. So I think what I would want to bring, because there's a lot that we can pull out on the specifics around housing affordability and policies at the city level or the state level, but we also have to talk about what it means to afford to live. And who and how do we hold leadership, how do people can afford to live wherever they choose, that we don't have to be driven out because the job dispersal between communities there's such a huge gap in terms of who's getting the jobs. That we're fighting for a $15 an hour minimum wage, which will become a fight for a $20 an hour minimum wage in a couple of years, right? That's a structural issue. So I think the best thing perhaps that I could leave in this discussion without getting too much into the weeds of the actual housing policies, we have to simultaneously address the economic imperative.
All right, Professor, you started something here. So apparently, there are a number of people in the audience who want you to expound on your last comment. So if you could incorporate that, right, pick the mic back up, incorporate that into your responses to the questions around what housing equity looks like and how we address some of the structural problems.
The mic bounced.
Yeah.
Well, building on what people are saying, we live in a capitalist society that is tremendously unequal. Therefore, if we don't fix that society, we have to look for solutions in which, regardless of inequality, we all fit. And to the extent that we live in a very unequal society, we will have neighborhoods of different incomes, and that won't change. So the point is, do we want to mix the poor with the less poor, because the less poor know how to live, and the poor don't know how to live, so that they become role models for them, which to me is white supremacy and white culture imposed on other groups. So at the end of the day, to me the big issue is, why do we, instead of destroying Inglewood by tearing down all this housing, why don't we recycle all that housing for people that want to stay in Inglewood so that they can get affordable housing in Inglewood? It's a totally complete shift. I currently, I'm a neighbor of Inglewood. I live in Washington Heights, and I am witness to the fact that people want to live in their community because that's where their networks are, that's where their supports are, that's where their extended families are. They don't want to be uprooted, to be given a subsidy for which they'll pay all their lives. So in that sense, to me the point is make living decent for people in the neighborhoods in which they are, resolve the problems, making the housing in those neighborhoods accessible to people. You don't have to create all these artificial subsidies. Give the subsidies
for the crowd in the audience who wanted to hear more, are you okay? Just maybe nodding of the head, or I'm seeing shaking heads. I'm seeing nodding and shaking. All right, so Professor Betancourt, you'll be here for a little bit after the forum, right? If people want to come up to you directly. We got security, so you're okay.
John, there is no back exit.
How much they pay an hour?
There's a back exit.
All right, we're going to bring Angela up next.
I think that.
All right, thank you.
She's going to talk about what she would like to see for the future of affordable, accessible housing in Chicago.
Hi. Right now, CHA Section 8 vouchers house most people with disabilities who live independently. Chicago needs laws to hold the CHA accountable for their failures. In the near future, we could lower the rents required by the Affordable Requirements Ordinance. Disabled people often make 20% AMI. The ARO rents are affordable to people who make 60% AMI. That does not make any sense. We could also give more money to property owners who are willing to make modifications. Ultimately, we need citywide rent control and brand new public housing. Solutions to the housing crisis that don't include accessibility are short-sighted. And we believe that if everyone realized that they would create deeply affordable new construction. I would also like to say, everybody here don't realize where you're going to be at 30 years from now. And I just want to say, I don't wish any disabled or physical issue with anyone in this room. Let me just stand clear and saying that. But we don't know what's going to happen in 30 years. And these things need to be set in stone for the future. Thank you.
Cliff notes again, right? That's right. All right. So we're talking about what does housing equity look like, and then what are how do we address the barriers? Okay. All right. So in a nutshell, when I think about housing equity, I think about people being able to live wherever they'd like to live. If they want to live in Egwish, they can live in Egwish. If they want to live downtown, they can live downtown. If they want to live in Norwood Park or Inglewood or wherever the case may be, whoever you are, race, ethnicity, income level, there is a place where you can find a home. And so kind of thinking about Janet's example about what if we had kind of done that plan for transformation in Lincoln Park, to me, that's kind of what housing equity would look like. It would look like reshuffling all of these neighborhoods where there is essentially only a certain kind of housing, only a certain level of affordability, and blowing that up and making sure that there essentially were a number of spaces for people in different income levels to slide in. And so that they can all have a range of options. Right now, if you earn $20,000 a year, you've got a very narrow place, a very narrow kind of spectrum where you can consider housing. And to me, equity would be everything is available to you. Maybe there's not a vacant unit, but there are a number of units where you could actually have an opportunity to live there. To me, one of the key things to try to address, and we've heard a couple other things already, but I will focus on race. Because, as Amara kind of mentioned earlier, there are groups who are just not valued. And when you're not valued, that has a profound impact on everything else that plays a part in your life. It has an impact on the kind of school you can go to, the kind of housing stock you can have, the value of your home. In a way, and this is a personal thing for me, I was born in the Clearports and spent a fair amount of my childhood there, but for the most part I grew up in the Albert Gresham neighborhood, 78th and Winchester, third floor of an Ivy line, 3-flat cool spot. But I bought my first home in 2005 in the Albert Gresham neighborhood, not far from where I grew up. And bought my home for $165,000. I lost my home to foreclosure last year. And the reason why is because I simply walked away from the home. The reason why I walked away from the home, aside from the frustration of not being able to get it refinanced from Bank of America and then the people they sold the loan to, long story. But my home had lost literally close to $100,000 in value. For no reason. I put a roof on it, I put in an air conditioning unit. I got the windows replaced, like 12 windows across the home. New screen doors, everything, right? And my home lost value. Why? Mortgage crisis had something to do with that, but that wasn't it. It was because I lived in Albert Gresham. The same bungalow on the north side would have sold for 3 times as much, and it would have taken a hit in the mortgage crisis. But you know what? Those bungalows up there are selling for what they sold for in 2005. Selling for more than that. My home, when I got the statement that I took to my tax preparer, showed how much I still owed on my loan, about $137,000, and the value of the home, $48,000. Wow. So to me, that is an essence of the structural problem that we're dealing with. Because if my neighborhood is devalued because of the people that live in the neighborhood, then that is going to have an impact on everything else. And so when we talk about housing equity, we got to talk about race in terms of the ways in which we value our communities. So I'll leave it at that. And yeah, if you guys got a back of your pocket solution to racism, then we're in good shape. We're in good shape. Yeah, thank you.
So for future organizing strategies, what are good strategies for making serious alliances, and who and between who? Do you guys have any good strategies for making alliances across groups? All right, conversation, dialogue, right? Pizza?
Food always.
Yeah,
I mean, the geography represented the people, the diversity.
Some of them might.
No,
You can
say.
You guys, basically, like what we're doing in real time right now is how we create alliances by listening to each other and being
Fighting together.
And fighting together, right? Yeah. So could the legal minds and experts on the panel expound on the systemic segregation effects on the city? Do these practices lay the groundwork for disparate impact? Claim for a disparate impact claim as it relates to minorities.
Yeah, so one of the things that, and this could be a solution or something that we should be moving towards strategically, is having a disparity study really across the entire city, across departments, but if we wanted to focus on just housing, whether it's the Department of Housing or within CHA, there has to be a disparity study to show the disparate impact of city policy. So what that would do is it would unearth and make transparent how communities are being affected and who is being affected, which then lays the groundwork for legal action, lawsuits, class actions, and so on and so forth, if a harm has been discovered.
In this, the legal route.
Yeah, yes, that is the drawback, right? So any legal avenue has to be supported by and pushed by grassroots action, and that's why what's happening in this space is absolutely necessary. Because we know that the legal tactics that are used are often about extending the process, it's about draining the resources of the plaintiff or the plaintiff class. Those are just tactics that are used. They've been used since lawyers were doing whatever lawyers have been doing. So the component necessary for this body is in building those alliances around shared values and making sure that we're coming out of our own spaces to work together. So something that really struck me is what was happening on the Northwest side in Jefferson Park around affordable housing, and the fact that they can link up with folks on the South Side who are fighting that same fight, because then it amplifies the rhetoric around why we're pushing and what we're pushing, right? That is incredibly important. It gives cover to those who are perhaps less courageous, and I'm talking about elected leadership, to make decisions that they feel may be unpopular, because when they see that it's not just this group here doing it, when they see that it's a collective, and especially communities that can be so far apart in terms of what we have in our minds when we think about these communities, that gives force and it gives power to the actions that we're pushing. So any kind of legal strategy, I think, has to be pushed by grassroots pressure on those who are in positions to make decisions that affect us.
Can I just add? I think that we were just talking about the cost of segregation report. I think that's your legal evidence that there is disparate impact. So disparate impact it means that the effect of policy has on people. It's not intentionally. I'm not trying to discriminate against you, but the effects of my policies results in discrimination. And I think if you look at the cost of segregation, the $4 billion not attained by people because of all these things that we just talked about, starts to become at least a conceptual framework. And it can become a rhetorical tool, to use the academic way of speaking of these, but where you start to put it out there and say, you know what, this cost is real, and we need to have repairs done to that. And that's what, or redress, to use the legal term in fair housing, right? What can we do about it? And start to use that as a conversation starter to maybe go the route that Amara was saying, how to interpret those results. No offense to FEC, but I view more of it from your policy perspective rather than we just have to move people around. So if we start to use the dollars and cents, I don't like that as an argument. I believe it's a moral imperative that we have to deal with here. But if we start to talk to people who understand money, which it's a moral hazard, I know, but we have to really get people to understand what this really means from the loss in our communities.
Then why Chicago is stagnated as it is about racism? Why is it that in today's society?
And just to clarify, MPC is an advocate for moving people. We had to come up with a title. We chose the title Cost of Segregation. That was a provocative title. We measured segregation, but underneath that, if you read the report, we discussed that the true enemy here is inequity. And so Amara's reaction, I think, really kind of helped crystallize that. And what we failed to do, perhaps, is to make that more transparent in the report. But by no means are we saying that the problem is simply because, or that the problem can be fixed simply by integrating. But anyhow, it was recommended that we call it the cost of racism when we kind of first rolled out the report, which probably would have been a more apropos title, but segregation was what we measured in the research, and so that was the principal reason why I worked with it. No, it's okay.
Okay, so another future question. Where is the CHA in terms of creating 25,000 units of housing? Recently, the CHA is building retail and tennis courts on their land. What about affordable housing?
That speaks for itself.
And actually, apparently, folks can't hear in the back, so if you could please, if you're going to answer this question, please come up to the
I don't want to speak for CHA.
You don't want to speak for CHA? Can you speak for what you're seeing CHA do? Yeah.
Described a ridiculous situation.
It is a ridiculous, I did just describe this ridiculous situation. So instead of creating 25,000 units, they're building retail and tennis courts. What about affordable housing? Anybody? Come on down.
To me, the plan of transformation was a plan to gentrify Chicago. Since gentrification is my forte, I could talk a lot about it. But the fact of the matter is that what CHA plan of transformation did was to unlock housing that was lacked by its occupation by black low-income people and some Latinos and some others, and make it available for developers to gentrify the city. So you have two elements in the plan of transformation. One is the reuse of the land that is in strategic locations for mixed income, ACA gentrification, and the closure of those that were beyond redemption, and maybe a third one, which is the case of Trumbull Park in South Erie, rehabilitating them for poor people only, which is the old way of public housing. But that was just an excuse to gentrify public housing sites, in my opinion. Sorry.
Very quickly. This reminds me of another study we did when I was at the Chicago Reporter. Kimberly Kelly was a writer on this one. I did the data analysis. But we were intrigued, this was in 2005 when we did this story, we were intrigued by the changes that were happening around some of the plan for transformation sites in terms of the real estate market and property sales that were taking place. So we looked at 2 blocks around the footprint of the 10 original. Remember when the plan for transformation was only supposed to be about 10 units or 10 developments, and then it became Leclerc Courts and what's the place up north, Latham Homes, and all these other. Well, anyway, so around the 10 that were originally part for the plan, 2 blocks around that place, we studied the residential property transactions over a 10-year period of time, from 1995 to 2005. And what we found was that around Cabrini, the 2 blocks around Cabrini, over $1 billion in real estate transactions in that 10-year period. Just this boom of activity. And about $1 billion collectively around the other 9 sites. My point was that in this very valued space, there was this enormous amount of activity. And then in many of the other spaces, there was not nearly as much activity. That was one thing. The other thing is speaking to the notion of the need for housing. I get questioned a lot. I do a lot of demographic reporting. I get questioned a lot about the African-American exodus from Chicago that's kind of happening, and what are some of the root causes of that. And I hear a lot of talk about violence, and it's like, housing, I think, is perhaps one of the things that we don't talk about enough. When Professor Bedninger talked about Inglewood, literally, like, you can walk through Inglewood and it looks like you're walking through neighborhoods after World War II over in Europe, like just bombed out places. The city's done a great job of tearing those spots down after they've been up for a little while. But it's either these empty units or these empty buildings or these vast swaths of land that are just open. And those were housing apartments. Those were developed units, and many of them lost to the foreclosure crisis. Literally tens of thousands of units in Black Chicago were lost during that. Apartment buildings that went through foreclosure and were never developed. But we have a need for housing, a desperate need for affordable housing. I guess I don't have to tell you guys this, but the exodus, I think, is really rooted in that. When we look at who's leaving, it's lower income, younger African Americans, it's families that are leaving. They don't have a place to stay, they can't find an affordable place, and therefore they go other places. And everybody's not moving to the south suburbs, as some might believe. They just have to find a place where they can afford to live. And Chicago no longer presents those opportunities.
question. In your opinion, what kind of policies and or best practices can be used to combat aldermanic privilege that has been used to maintain and further segregate our communities?
All right now. Thank you. Come on now. Take it, John.
I'm sorry, I'm wearing my activist hat today. Chicago doesn't have a democracy. Chicago has an aristocracy, a democratic machine. And unfortunately, the black community cannot put together the money that it takes to elect one of their own representatives.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, they have to vote or elect the one that City Hall endorses, and not only endorses, but also pays his campaign for. So the democratic system in the black community has been snatched, and they cannot appoint their own people. As long as you cannot appoint your own people, they are not going to represent you, they are going to represent City Hall.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I think what we need is a mobilization of voters. Mobilization of voters to actually bring those people down from office. Now, one of the problems of the democratic system is that it is so corrupted by the way in which it is financed. And therefore, if you don't have the money, you don't bear a chance. And in that sense, the key element to return to people the ability to elect their own people is to reform that way in which it is financed. I don't think a representative should be allowed to use more money than another representative to be elected. And I don't think that people that don't have wealthy friends or wealthy pockets should be allowed to put more money into campaigns than people that don't have them. And only when that happens, neighborhoods will be able to elect their own. And I think the critical point to change this town is to bring back democracy. Thank you.
Do you have another comment on that question? That was a hard one to follow. All right. So for our final question, the CHA has been sitting on $350 million of our money for what? For more than 15 years. Money that was supposed to be used to build new replacement public housing. Very few, less than 10% has been built. What should we do to get this money, and what should it be used for?
The money should be used for why it was intended, which is to create affordable housing. Part of the issue is that when the plan for transformation was put into place, your families are dispersed to the four corners, and what we see in a lot of those communities is sort of a waiting period. So in a lot of these areas where families were moved out to the suburbs or wherever they went, you didn't see immediate investment. You see all the things are allowed to sort of erode to the point where the population continues to decline. So that's what's happening at those sites, all those areas where the real estate market determines this is an area of high value, and so you start to see the investment in those particular areas. But in other areas where that wasn't the case, the conditions in those communities began to erode, and they were allowed, in my opinion, by virtue of the public policies that were or were not put in place to erode. But there's also something that's happening in the places where those families and individuals had gone. They were getting further and further disconnected from the reality of being able to come back. And so as time went on, it becomes much more difficult for one who moved out of the city or out of their particular area to then come back to that area. So once your kids are in school somewhere else, what is the likelihood that within a couple of years, or 10 years, 15 years, you will pick up and move them back to the city? So I argue that there was some intentionality in the waiting period. There's some intentionality around sitting on a surplus and allowing those families to get comfortable and or situated or cemented where they are to decrease the likelihood of them being able to come back to their communities. That's a matter of public policy. None of this is, in my opinion, by happenstance. And so the way that we push back is by first the exposure that was happening. At that time, it was, I think the number was actually around $425 million that we were sitting on. And it wasn't until that was exposed that people began to wonder and ask, well, why are we sitting on this surplus when we have a waiting list of thousands, tens of thousands of people? So transparency is the key in mandating that transparency. Whether it's with CHA, the Department of Housing, or any other public entity, they have to be transparent about that. The second is really connecting the dots on how all of this works at a systems level. The fact that certain schools in different neighborhoods are disinvested is not an accident. It means that there's an unwillingness to put money into an area where you don't foresee the population being there. Think about the timing, even what's happening in Inglewood. Yes, there are entire blocks of open land, open space that have existed for years. And now we start to see, now there's a Whole Foods in Inglewood, which is apparently the panacea. But who is that for? A lot of those families that moved out will not be able to come back, and even if they did, those structures were torn down. So they have no place to go. So I think part of it is also just looking at the systems level about how all of these things are connected, and that there is intentionality behind these policies. But from our lens, we have to operate with the same intentionality to push back on those policies.
So I agree completely with everything that Amara said. Is anyone here from the Central Advisory Council involved in CHA housing residents? Or from the Coalition to Protect Public Housing, if you remember that? So when I came to Chicago 20 years ago, I was fortunate enough to get involved with the Coalition to Protect Public Housing, which really fought hard against the plan for transformation. And in losing that battle, I wouldn't say losing it, but meaning the plan went forward. There were a lot of things, though, that continued in that fight. And we worked with the Central Advisory Council, which represents the elected leadership for the different developments, those that were left, as well as bringing in at-large people from Section 8. And some people who are involved in leadership in other organizations here in this community, or in this space I mean right now. And in 2012, if you recall, Mayor Rahm Emanuel unveiled to a limited audience, a closed-door event on a Saturday, what he called Plan 2.0, which, as someone who teaches urban planning, and if someone handed that in to me as an assignment, they would have failed. For a very expensive investment, supposedly, to create a plan that has a lot of pretty pictures. I wouldn't say they're that pretty, but pictures with very little words and very little action. At the same time, residents worked with people like me and other people who kind of could help with the research to be very thoughtful and intentional about thinking about what a Plan 2.0 should look like. A real plan that was driven by the community, by the residents. That plan still exists, and I would say that most of those things are still useful tools and strategies and very concrete things that people have been working on getting done, but it's the housing piece. And so going back to the very beginning of our panel, I think we talked about something, Joanza, where a group of people went into HUD and stood on a table, locked some doors, made some phone calls. I mean, there's something's got to be done, but to go in and not just complain, but go and look at, we've got something here. This is a plan we could do right now. In fact, at the time that plan went, before it was released, then the Housing Authority's CEO, I don't remember who that was, they've been revolving door, right? But whoever it was said, you know, look, I'm looking at 75% of this, I could agree to. We could work on this. But it was conveniently pushed away, conveniently devalued. And I think we need to, as a collective, look at how, and working through, you know, all the different work that you already do, but we think how we bring to the table those things that exist and that have already been proven, because they're based on research of what has worked elsewhere. In fact, in many communities, we drew from many communities that Housing Authority director had worked in, and he knew it worked. We need to look at what we have at hand already. Thank you.
All right, so that's concludes the question and answer portion. We just want to thank all of our volunteers, the card collectors, sorters, folks that set everything up. Can we give them a round of applause? I also want to talk a little bit about our next series, our next discussion series. It's going to be called Envisioning Housing Justice in a Segregated City, a two-part discussion series focused on solution strategies and alliances. Part 2 is called Intersections. It's going to take place on Tuesday, March 6th from 3 to 5 p.m. and it's going to be in this exact same spot. So I really hope that you guys can come by. We're gonna put hopefully all the pieces together and find a solution.